Harvard for 400 years now has been the example of a global education brand that represents what American higher ed means. And to me, the first and most important part of that is putting academics first and above all else, right? Harvard is supposed to stand for academic excellence, full stop. And I think the second thing it's supposed to stand for is free inquiry, kind of an enlightenment mindset, having truly open academic conversations. And so I think Harvard needs to recenter on that to represent America and represent the best of the best. You know, Harvard is ranked last in terms of on-campus free speech. I've had so many phone calls from professors, people who say, look, I really agree with you, or here's how to think about this, but I can't speak up. This is off the record, right? And that really speaks to this culture where there's a lot of people who aren't able to actually express their opinions in an academic setting. And that's a real shame. We've ended up in this place with Harvard as a kind of an example to a lot of other institutions, really representing American higher ed, where there isn't free speech in the classroom. But then outside the classroom, for some reason, it is okay to have bullhorns in the freshman dorm when kids are trying to study, which hurts the academic mission, right? So in some ways, it's completely reversed, right? You should have free speech in the classroom. You know, you're a free American citizen. If you want to protest, go to Boston Common, but you can't interrupt this private university and our mission to drive towards the best academics in the world. The example Harvard sets kind of then sets up what the rest of American higher ed stands for and what it drives towards. And I really think we've got things pretty backwards right now.
Hello and welcome to Notes from the Front, where we feature inspiring guests fighting to make a positive difference in the world. I'm your host, Michelle Tambler. Today, we're speaking with Sam Lessin, a prominent figure in tech and venture capital. Sam has held several exciting roles in his career. He was a VP of product at Facebook and then a founder of two companies, Drop.io and Fin. Most recently, he co-founded and is a general partner at Slow Ventures, a VC firm that has raised over $750 million. He's invested in dozens of innovative startups like Venmo, Solana, and TeamShares, and Sam also writes prolifically both on Twitter and The Information. In this episode, we'll explore Sam's latest endeavor, an against all odds run for the Harvard Board of Overseers. Sam, a Harvard alum, has grown increasingly alarmed by changes on the Harvard campus in recent years. He believes that the school requires serious reform and must focus on academic excellence above all else while embracing free speech in the classroom and beyond. We'll delve into what this role entails, the significance of the Harvard example in higher education, and the challenges of running as a write-in candidate. I found the conversation quite fascinating, and I hope you will too. Let's dive in. All right, Sam, it's great to see you again. How are you?
Michelle, it's great to see you. I'm great. How was your New Year's?
It was good. All right, so Sam and I have discussed creating a piece of content to discuss his run for Harvard Overseer Board. And he is calling this the Harvard Overseer Bid. Maybe to kick us off, Sam, can you explain what is the Harvard Overseer Board and why you are running for it?
Absolutely. And again, thanks for doing this with me. So look, Harvard has two governing bodies. Basically run, ultimately the buck stops with them in terms of decision-making in the universe. One is the corporation, which is, I'd say, better known. Very small group. There's 13 seats, 12 of them are filled currently. And these people, they elect, basically they have terms and then they elect who comes next after them. It's very tightly held. It's a very small group. I almost have been describing it as like the Senate Harvard, if that makes sense, on a mini scale. And then just as Harvard has a Senate, it also has a House, right? And the House is a little bit bigger. It's called the Harvard Overseers. Instead of it being 9 people, it's 30. And it's interesting because there's two stories about the overseers. The one story is kind of how it's operated recently, where Harvard has been very dominated by the corporation's in charge, and the overseers play a role, but the role is much more academic review, things like that. It's a softer touch, right? Has been the story in modern times. If you actually go back to the Harvard Charter of 1650, which amazingly Harvard 400 years still operates under, the overseers actually really have some pretty important roles. They approve who becomes president, approve who gets on the corporation. They have a lot of rights and actually can have a lot of power in the university. And I think, hopefully we'll get into this, but given the real challenges that Harvard faces, in this upcoming period and after a pretty disastrous fall, it's kind of time for the overseers to step up and kind of, I think, take a bigger role that they're kind of historically entitled to, rather than kind of leaving it all to the corporation.
Okay, that's a helpful. I want to make sure I fully understand this because I've also
Yeah,
now looked this up. I've looked on the Harvard page and I think it's a little confusing.
it's super
Okay,
confusing.
because we've been reading about the board in the
Yes,
news a lot recently, and that's referring to Harvard Corporation
that's the
Board, right?
corporation. Yes,
The
correct.
corporation.
Yes, it's
And
the
so when
corporation.
people say the corporation, what they are referring to is that board,
That's correct. That's
and
correct.
that is the 13 people.
It's actually 12. There's a whole scandal about why there isn't 13 people. There's actually only 12, but it's supposed to be 13.
Okay, let's put that in the parking lot.
100%. We can go infinitely deep on all of the intrigue. There's so much of it once you start diving in.
Okay, got it. So when people refer to the Harvard Corporation, for some reason, I thought that was like some sort of legal entity. I didn't realize that that referred to that governing body of 12 people.
No, that's what it is. I mean, again, Harvard is, again, it's so old. You have to remember it's chartered, it dates back to 1650. And so when you go all the way back, it's actually even slightly older than that, depending on how you count. But it is so ancient that there's actually these two bodies that effectively govern the entire university's, system. And you got to keep in mind also, remember that the modern Harvard of today, which is a sprawling thing with all these schools, it's very different than what Harvard was even 100 years ago, right? It still functions under this pretty tightly controlled, small group of people.
And they called it the corporation back in
The
1650?
corporation. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, got it. So,
It's
and that's
very
the
like,
one that
how if you
Penny
step back, it is a little James Bond, isn't it? The corporation again.
I'm like, was that even a word back then? Penny Pritzker, she's on that one, right? She's the head of it?
She is the head of that one. That's correct.
And does she have some title?
I don't actually know if there's a technical title, but she is the head of the corporation or the.
Okay, head of
I don't
got
know if
it.
there's a title for it.
And does everyone on that board need to be an alum?
No, I don't think on either bud you technically need to be an alum. Technically, in practice, they all are. Is my sense, or pretty much. I think we can get into this, but on the overseer side, it's voted by the alum, so it's unsurprising that the alum is one of basically people who have a connection to Harvard. Mm. But it's a good question whether technically they have to be. I think in practice they all are.
Okay, so the 30 people on the overseers board,
Yep.
how often are they sort of moved in and out? How long is a term? How do they get elected? How does it all
Yeah. So
work?
so again, there's a simple version and the complicated version, as everything with Harvard. And the simple
Let's do
version
the
is
simple version.
let's do the simple version. The simple version is a 6-year term, right? You come in and you have 6 years on the overseers. It's an elected position that's voted on by the alums of Harvard. And so, basically, if you went to any of the Harvard schools, it's about 330,000 alums around the world. You can put your vote in and pick, who should be on the overseers board representing you and kind of acting. I would almost think of it as the house of Harvard, being a check and balance on the corporation, helping lead the organization, et cetera. Now, I won't go too deep on the more complicated version, but I think the thing to understand is that in practice, what happens is HAA, which is Harvard's official alumni organization, puts forward a slate, right? And that slate is usually people who have been extremely involved in HAA, president of HAA, been in the Harvard Club of New York, et cetera. And they say, these are the people to vote for. And it's a very tightly controlled process. So while it's technically a vote where anyone can run and it represents Harvard alums, in practice, only about 30,000, about 10% of alums vote. And the people that are put forward for that voting is very tightly controlled by Harvard's official alumni body more than anything else.
Got it. And now you're trying to run as a write-in candidate, correct?
Yes, correct.
Okay,
So
so
I am
HAA
not.
is not sponsoring you.
No, they're not. And I
Do
think
they know you're running?
they do. And again, to be clear, governing body, right, which is separate than HA, that has to know you're running, and that. But the answer is yes, they know. But what I'd say, there's an interesting history of this, which is over the years, every once in a while, something comes up, or a group of alums say, "Hey, HA really isn't representing our beliefs, so we're going to petition," which you're able to do, and say, "We'd like to be on the ballot and try to run for overseer, even though we're not technically being nominated by HAA." It's a very uphill battle. Interesting, the last time this happened was in 2020 with something called Harvard Forward that had some investiture goals and things like that. And they actually were able to get a few petition candidates on, which was interesting. So what the organization did in response, so they didn't like that very much, is they upped the requirement from saying you just need 500 signatures, easily a piece of paper, effectively. You need 3,300 through, which is 1% of Harvard's population of alums, and 10% of who even votes in these things, which kind of makes it sound a lot bigger because it is a big number. And it needs to be done through Crimson Key and Harvard Key, et cetera. So they basically upped the requirement to make it much more difficult, and then also limit the number of petition candidates they can even get on. So the bar has been raised, but it is still technically doable.
What was it before? 500?
500. Just
and
500.
Was it still through Harvard Key and all that?
I don't think I mean, Harvard Key is a relatively recent system in terms of it being rolled out to the alumni, right? And I think the intentions are good. It's like good to have, digital sign-on and identity, as the university. In practice, unfortunately, the reality is that in the polling I've done, only about 50 to 60% of alums, and mostly the younger ones, have it set up. And I will tell you, I have a long list of support emails coming to me saying, "Hey, Sam, I'd love to vote for you," and I have no idea how to get Harvard Key set up. So that it's a real limiter, to say the least.
I just went through it. I had forgot my password. I didn't remember this Harvard Key thing. So
yeah, it's a
definitely
little
adds
wild.
friction. Okay, so you have to have got it. So just let me clarify and make sure I understand this. You do not have the support of HAA. They are not putting you forward. No. You have to get 3,300 people to log into this system and enter in your name.
Yes.
And when does this have to be done by?
The 31st. So we got about, we got 2.5 weeks.
18 days.
18 days.
Okay,
I'm being
well, we'll see how quickly I can edit this. No, 19 days. Okay.
Well, in fairness, I did start this process a few weeks ago, so it's not like we're starting from zero here. It's actually been an interesting thing, which is mid-December. I love Harvard. I think it really matters. It's the most well-known educational brand in the U.S. and probably the world. So I think the example they set does really matter, right, for the rest of the world. And so I kind of, like many, were very frustrated and disappointed in their response. And in mid-December, I said, beyond just saying I'm not going to donate, anytime soon, right, and things need to change, I said, hey, what else can I do to be helpful? And I kind of identified this. At this point, by my count, there's now 7 people, all of whom I think mostly agree on policy changes, who are trying to do this at the same time. The good news about that is that there's a lot of energy, right? And there's a real alumni voice saying that HAA is not representing, the beliefs of the broader alumni. And so there's, I think, a real consensus on that. That's great. The bad news is, as with any election system, it's just more noise and less focus, right? And so it is going to be one of those things where the good news is that there's so much energy on this. The bad news is that to your point, from a brass tacks perspective, you need 3,300 people to sign on the line just for you to get on, and you can at max have 2 petition candidates on. It's kind of complicated in terms of where things are today.
Got it. So 7 people are doing are attempting to do a write-in bid for 2 slots.
Right. And that's changed. I mean, for me, I think I was the first to announce doing this. And there's a woman named Julia, who's wonderful, who's doing it. Harvey Silvergate, who's one of the founders of FIRE, the free speech organization, and has actually done this before, is trying again, as is Judge Harry Hartz, a federal judge. And then, if you're following attention in the craziness of this, Bill Ackman just put forward 4 people who are ex-military, who, again, everyone has slightly different principles, but everyone would say broadly aligned in what needs to change. The difference is, how would they approach working as a community with people and what's going to actually be done? My concern, again, the good news, it's great energy. The bad news, it's a lot of noise.
Yep. Wait, so Bill Ackman is putting forward 4 people?
Bill Ackman just 2 days ago said, this is my slate for Harvard overseers. He put forward 4 people for 2 slots, which is a little confusing. I think the good news is, I think, again, it's attention. The bad news is, again, it's split attention in a lot of ways. And I do worry a little bit. I think Bill Ackman's been great. I've been kind of a big supporter of a lot of what he's been saying broadly. I think he's broadly been right, and he has the right messaging. I'm a little worried that his slate has more to do with Twitter than it does with actually getting on the overseers and making change. But that's another topic for another day.
Why isn't he putting himself forward for it?
Well, first, it's a lot of work. I mean, I think I think is part of it. It's the Board of Overseers is not a joke. They meet 6 times a year in person in Cambridge. You have to be ready to do that, and actually, just at a baseline. And then, if you actually hope to make any change and use it as a place to ask questions, the overseers have a very important role especially in this upcoming year, because when they are a big part of selecting the next president. Just as everyone's looking at the corporation and blaming the corporation for gay and being the wrong choice and things like that, the overseers agree to, right? And they might be in some ways seen as a junior board, but they're just as responsible. That's like a major power. And I just think, if I were Bill Ackman and even as Sam Lessin, I say, look, I'm willing to invest the time, but it's not a joke, right? If you actually hope to actually make a difference here to, what the requirement and effort is to make, it has to be kind of one of your priorities, in the next few years.
Yeah. What happens if all 7 people get 3,300 signatures?
Then whoever has the two most of those 33. And again, there's a whole other thing, which is how did this process change? Who really said okay to like raising these requirements and saying you can't have as many petition candidates? The same thing goes, by the way, with the Harvard Corporation. If you get into it, Harvard expanded the corporation, the number of people on it, and changed how it worked pretty meaningfully. And it's not even clear that that was legal for them to do, but it's also unclear who would ever sue them about it. So a lot of these things, what you start figuring out when you get into the weeds here is you say, well, what happened at Harvard and how do we fix it? And everyone has really interesting perspectives. I've talked to a lot of different people in the leadership teams and the administration, professors. I think a lot of silent people too, want to see change and a lot of this fixed. Right? Which is, there's the same thing about the themes are there. But then how do you actually do it? There's so many nooks and crannies of a 400-year-old institution where you almost end up with a drift where these things happen, right? Not necessarily with everyone even being responsible. You have to start thinking about how to claw back, what principles to put in place, and how to make this thing work, right? So
It
it's
sounds
kind
like
of
there's
wild.
been sort of a power grab slash takeover by the current board of overseers if they've change the rules to make it difficult for other people to
It's not, I don't think it's the overseers as much as it is HAA. And it's really interesting to say, again, I've been working on this now for a while and talking about a lot of great people. One of the nice parts about running and being out there and wanting to help Harvard is the number of really interesting people that have called me with perspectives, all, of course, deeply off the record, have been fascinating. Right? I learned so much about the inner workings of Harvard. But look, it's not clear that it was some, maniacal person with a power grab. Some people think it's just organizational drift because you have these administrators that have been in place forever who actually run things day to day. It's almost like the bureaucracy is leading the boards, right? In a lot of ways, which is a problem. Just as one fact of it, there's literally one, you talk about how do the overseers function? Well, it turns out that you have the overseers that are elected, but then there's actually one guy who's been doing committee assignments for the overseers since the mid 1990s. And what committees you're on defines what you end up taking on or not and things like that. And some people argue that, the whole overseer election is kind of, it's not a joke, but like the more important part of like who's doing what is controlled by one administrator who isn't elected, right? And that's as much of a problem as anything else, right? And so how do you move that forward? How do you make changes there organizationally to help the organization recover from the fall, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay, there are a couple of things you said that I want to loop back to.
Yeah.
Okay, so I forget the exact wording, but you said something like Harvard really matters, or the example that they set matters.
Totally. Yeah.
And that you were very frustrated. You decided you weren't going to donate, but that you were thinking, what else can I do?
Yeah.
Can you speak more about why you think the example they set matters and
Sure.
why you care so much about this that you are going to this effort to run?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think one, again, I am a loyal Harvard alum. I think Harvard's a fabulous institution. I have a ton of friends from there. I want to see it be a fabulous institution for the next generation of students that it was for me. So there's a personal element to this too. It's not purely intellectual. But I'd say on the intellectual basis, Harvard for 400 years now has been, especially in the last century, has been kind of the example, a global education brand that represents what American higher ed means. And to me, the first and most important part of that is putting academics first and above all else, right? Harvard is supposed to stand for academic excellence, full stop. And I think the second thing it's supposed to stand for is free inquiry, kind of an enlightenment mindset, having truly open academic conversations. Now, unfortunately, if you've been following the news over the last many years, which really came to a head this fall, those two things are quite challenged, right? One, in terms of putting academics above all else, they lost the Supreme Court case in terms of their admission practices. Gay and the organization has had kind of an explicit DEI mission, right? Which and responsibility, which has stretched or pushed far away from just being academics first in a lot of cases. And that's a real problem. I think we can get into why, but Harvard doesn't want to be dragged into the country's politics. They say, hey, stay out of our business when the Senate comes asking, things like that. But at the same time, the trade is supposed to be for great academic institutions. They are not political themselves, right? They are neutral. They stay out of these things. You can't have it both ways. And so I think Harvard needs to recenter on that to kind of represent America, represent the best of the best, and what we stand for. And then I think the second thing comes to the speech issues. Harvard is ranked last in terms of on-campus free speech, especially in the academic setting. And so if you think about it, I've had so many phone calls from professors, people who say, look, I really agree with you, or here's how to think about this, but I can't speak up. This is off the record, right? And that really speaks to this culture where there's a lot of people who aren't able to actually express their opinions in an academic setting. And that's a real shame, because that's the principle that true academic freedom Harvard should stand for. So it's weird. We've ended up in this place with Harvard as a kind of an example to a lot of other institutions, really representing American higher ed, where there isn't free speech in the classroom, right? People feel limited in what they can say. They're not able to explore a full range of ideas, et cetera. But then outside the classroom, for some reason, it is okay to have bullhorns in the freshman dorm when kids are trying to study, which hurts the academic mission, right? So in some ways, it's completely reversed, right? You should say, you should have free speech in the classroom. You're a free American citizen. If you want to protest, go to Boston Common, but you can't interrupt this private university and our mission to drive towards the best academics in the world, right? So I don't know. I think the example Harvard sets kind of then sets up what the rest American higher ed stands for and kind of what it drives towards. And I really think we've got things pretty backwards, right?
I think that makes a lot of sense. On the point about they should not be political themselves, I'd be curious for your opinion on, something that I noticed was it feels like the universities now are expected to create these condemnation letters every single time something happens that's internationally, I don't know, in focus. So I feel like a lot of, for example, Jewish alums were very upset that Harvard did not release a statement about the Hamas attack on Israel quickly enough. Right. And
Well,
then they were like, oh, back in 2020, Harvard released this, and this at this pace. And then now they're not releasing a statement. And I've been left wondering, is Harvard expected to, should they always release a statement? Should they never release a statement? What do you think on
yeah,
that?
I think, look, the number one thing is you got to be consistent, right? You're a platform. You set up rules and you have to be consistent. I actually think, Michelle, to your point, Chicago, I think, basically has it right, which is they have this deep doctrine of neutrality, right, and staying out of everything. And I think that makes a lot of sense, right? And if Harvard actually was embodied that and kind of had that principle and stuck to it, I think it would make all the sense in the world for them to say, we don't comment on anything, right? We're an academic institution. We stay out of all of it. What happened was George Floyd, right, was this moment, right, where a lot of people stood up and said they felt like they needed to comment, break with tradition, et cetera, and they kind of got involved. And the problem is, I don't think you can be selective about these things, right? If you're going to be an organization that comments on them, you have to be consistent and set up policies around that. If you're going to be someone who stays neutral, that's completely respectable. What is not okay is being inconsistent, because it basically it's just all downside. And the irony is, I spent a big part of my career at Facebook, very interesting period, because it was a period when Facebook went from being an application that some college kids used to a global platform, right? Where a lot of the world's speech was happening. And I'll tell you, we wrestled with a lot of these issues. What are the standards, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I don't actually, what I'd say as a proud Facebook alum, definitely did not get everything right, and there's a lot of, there's a whole history there, right? But I did see what that wrestling was like. And I think the thing Harvard has to understand is, like Facebook, it's a global brand and a global platform, which means that it needs to have consistent enforced rules, right? Whatever they are, right? And it can't just be all over the place in terms of these responses. So to me, as a Jewish Harvard alum, I'd say, if you took out the George Floyd, if they never commented on anything, right, I'd say, fine. That's just how it is, right? I still think protect student safety and the academic mission. I still think protests in the court. There's a lot of things that say you have to stop. I still think the question of people using the Harvard brand and Harvard funds as undergraduate clubs to promote hate is a really challenging one. It's literally Harvard's money used for these things. But I would understand it if there hadn't been a George Floyd response. In the context of the George Floyd response, it's completely inexcusable.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, are there any high level changes that you could see yourself advocating for with a lot of
Yeah.
conviction?
So I think the answer is there's a bunch, and it's really interesting because I think going to this campaign and then hopefully getting elected and working on the overseers, we can get there. We get hoping we can. What are the principles you stand for, and then what are the opportunities to actually have impacts tactically, right? And you kind of have to look at both. The principle stuff, hopefully, we've talked a bunch about, and I think people academics first, right? That's in pulling Harvard back from any politics. It's making sure there's real free speech in the classroom and that students are safe, right? And feel like they can be there and pursue their academic goals. Like, not super common principles level. And by the way, most people running for overseer, I think, broadly share those views, as do a lot of the administrators and a lot of the leaders at the school. Question is then tactically how to get there. You need a strong president. Gay was not a good choice, right? Like, she turned out to be a weak leader, right, in a moment of extreme crisis. I do think she's a symptom as much as the cause. I don't think putting this all on her makes any sense. Right? I think she was there at a wrong time, but she clearly was an ineffective leader. And then on an academic basis, say what you will about what's plagiarism, what's the person who leads the premier education brand in America and potentially the world needs to be one of the most academically credible people in the world, full stop, right? And she's clearly not, right, in terms of what's come out. So that was a bad choice, and that's on the overseers, that's on the corporation. One thing I know tactically is that I will be involved, the overseer will be involved in picking the next president. Better pick a good one, right? Then there's questions of like, I am sure, I have very high confidence the university is going to make decisions on whether they should have some sort of neutrality position they keep in. Like, I think that's an important thing to push on. We'll be very tactically how to get there. Administrative reform, are you going to overhaul all of Harvard's administration next year? Almost certainly not. Let's be honest. That's not realistic. But there probably are key moments and key places that will come up where, I would be in a position to ask the right questions and advocate for the right things and kind of ideally play this insider outsider role, which is, you need to be able to work with the insiders or you won't get anything done, right? I think if you come in and you're flaming everyone all the time and you're just, that's fine. You might, but it's not a very effective thing. So you need someone who can cooperate internally. But at the same time, like, from my perspective, especially if I get elected on this slate and with these goals, the whole point, right, is to be able to stand up and say, hey, someone needs to be asking these questions, right? I wasn't elected through the HAA process. I'm not here as a favor to kiss rings. I'm here to make sure the right thing.
Mm-hmm. I like this term insider outsider. That's really neat. That's kind of inspiring. I would like to be an insider outsider somewhere.
Yeah, I think I've had, the good news, I've had that opportunity a few times in my life. I'm actually familiar with the insider outsider role, and I think I could have real help. I could really help.
I like it. Okay, before we wrap, anything else you would like to say about how people can help if they're a Harvard alum, if they're not an
Yeah.
alum?
So
How can
yeah,
how can we get you
I
on
appreciate the question.
this insider outsider role?
There's two things, right? As a Harvard alum, I would really ask if kind of what I'm saying resonates and you believe in the principles. If you go to samforoverseer.com, there's a link. It tells you how to nominate me. It's not that complicated, but it's kind of worth going through the web flow for it because if you went and Googled how to do this, how to nominate someone, you will never find it. You can argue about whether that's on purpose or not. But I have outlined directions for you about how to nominate me. Share it with your Harvard friends. If you didn't go to Harvard and you have friends who did, or obviously if you have an alumni community, it'd be great. And please reach out. I like want to. I'm at Lessin on Twitter. I'm happy to engage. Ultimately, this is going to be a ground game in terms of just getting people to say not only, hey, this is a cool idea, or like Sam seems reasonable, but I'm willing to take the 5 minutes to nominate him. I think once we get that done and through the nomination process, I have a lot of confidence with momentum. I can get on the overseers, but the hard part is just getting nominated.
Mm-hmm. And then if you're not a Harvard alum,
share it with Harvard alum friends.
Okay, great.
Unfortunately, you have to graduate. I'll tell you a funny story, which is Harvard. The website for this has unfortunately been broken a bunch, which is a whole other set of problems in terms of you got to keep the website up if you're not able to go through these processes. But I did at one point talk about being Harvard alums. Had one person message me being like, the website's broken. And I messaged the administrator and they said, Sam, the website this time, it was broken before, it's actually not broken this time. This person's wrong. And I went back and they said, hey, by the way, I know you went to Harvard. Did you graduate? And they go, oh, yeah, I didn't graduate. so unfortunately, that is kind of the requirement to this thing.
Oh, my goodness. All right. Need to have graduated. So actually, yes, I received an email from someone a couple days ago, a friend of mine. I had no idea that you knew this person. And it was an email that said, please vote to Sam Lessin, in all capitals, for Harvard's Board of Overseers. And I guess he sent it out to a lot of people. I think what I'll do is I'll attach in the show notes the link to your website. I'll also, if you thought that I think you know what email I'm talking about. I can put that as a template for people.
That'd be great. Yes,
send.
That'd be great.
And I'm rooting for you,
Michelle. I appreciate you taking the time. It's great to see you.
All right.
Thanks for doing this.
All right. That is a wrap for this conversation. In the show notes, you can find a link to Sam's website that include instructions on how to nominate him for the board. You can also find there a sample email to send to Harvard alums or friends of alums. Thank you so much for listening and hope to see you next time.